Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining in today's webinar on enhancing competition and resiliency in livestock markets. My name is Rob Larew, and I'm the president of National Farmers Union. This webinar is one in a series of events leading up to NFU's National Convention on Monday and Tuesday of next week. Many industries are rapidly consolidating, and agricultural markets are already among the most highly concentrated in the United States. The pandemic brought renewed attention to the vulnerability of monopolized agricultural supply chains, most evident in the massive disruptions in livestock slaughter and meat processing. Meaningful reform is urgently needed to restore competition in agriculture and across all segments of our economy. Today, we will be joined by two legislators at the forefront of efforts to promote more competitive markets. First, we'll hear from Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, who recently introduced the Competition and Antitrust Enforcement Reform Act. This bill strengthens protections against anti-competitive mergers, restricts harmful conduct by dominant firms, and increases resources for enforcement. Senator Klobuchar has also introduced legislation to expand opportunities for smaller meat packers. Representative Chellie Pingree of Maine has also been working to address the severe shortage of local and regional meat processing. She has introduced several pieces of legislation that would increase local slaughter and processing capacity, help smaller processors upgrade their plants, and better connect local farmers and consumers. But before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any technical questions or issues during this session, feel free to use and ask within the chat box, and an NFU staff member will help you out. This webinar is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others, you will find a link on our convention website in the next few days. Also, this is the first of two webinars we're hosting today. At 3:30 p.m. Eastern, you can also use the same link you received for this session and take part in a session on how biofuels will factor into policies from the new Congress and administration. Hope that you can make it to that one as well. With that, I'm now going to turn it over to Gary Wertish, president of Minnesota Farmers Union, to introduce our first speaker.
Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce our senator from Minnesota. Senator Klobuchar has been a strong, not only a good friend, a strong supporter of agriculture and a very good friend of National Farmers Union and Minnesota Farmers Union. You know, the title of this seminar this morning, and then ties into legislation that Senator Klobuchar has introduced, is a strong, in a long time, policy position of National Farmers Union and our concerns with the competition in the livestock industry. So with that, Senator Klobuchar, welcome to this seminar.
Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Rob. And I know you have basically been taking over the reins here of the National Farmers Union right during the pandemic. And that is kind of like, you know, taking over a ship in the middle of a hurricane, as far as I can see. And so I just want to thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Gary, for your incredible work that you've done in Minnesota. I'm so proud of our Minnesota Farmers Union. I have to say a few words about that because they have been on the front line for so long of fighting for our small farmers. And also they have this incredible presence where they've been able to rejuvenate themselves over the years. They have one of the most popular booths at the Minnesota State Fair, which is an urban state fair, with their frozen mocha on a stick and cool music and the like. And for anyone that hasn't seen it, once we're through this pandemic, I really suggest taking a trip to the Minnesota State Fair. I know you guys all have your own fairs nationally, but ours is pretty good. So Rob asked me to speak today on some issues that are really, really important to ag and really to our whole economy. I think that you know that we've seen more and more consolidation. I always think about this woman I met in a diner in Albert Lea, Minnesota, and she was a farmer, her husband was a farmer, and they were there with his brother. And she said to me, "Oh, I saw you on TV this week. And I said, oh, is it about Russian interference in the election? Because I'd done all these interviews. She said, no, it was about big. It was about things getting too big. And I thought, and she said, that's hurting us. And I thought, that is a better way to talk about this than all this fancy legal language. And I actually don't even like the word antitrust, even though I have a book coming out called Antitrust, because that's what it's called right now, antitrust. But I think the better word is competition policy, because I think it's more positive. And one of the things I actually did with I'm taking over the gavel for the subcommittee and judiciary of antitrust is to change the order of the words to competition policy first. And I think your members know what's been going on in the ag areas, the market consolidation, the vertical integration, the issues that we've had for suppliers, buyers, processors, really throughout the ag area is what we're seeing throughout the country. For ag, you just look at the facts. Just 2 companies have almost 80% of the corn seed market, and 4 companies have more than 75% of the soybean seed market. Between 95 and 2011, the cost of purchasing seeds to plant 1 acre of soybeans and corn increased 325% and 259%, because you think about what that means. And yields per acre only increased 18.9% and 29.7%. So farmers are paying a lot more, but they're not getting a lot more. And when it comes to selling their crops or their livestock, farmers and ranchers have ever fewer options as they struggle to get a fair price from the giant processors that dominate the markets. And so that's your part of the pie, of course, but I think this is market wide. You see what we've seen with tech, which does affect everyone, all small business and all small farmers. The fact that Google has 90% of the search market. The fact that when the House started to look at what was going on with tech last year, they discovered an email that Mark Zuckerberg had sent about Instagram and WhatsApp and his purchase of those, what seemed like smaller companies at the time. And he basically wrote back, and I'm paraphrasing this, but he said, yeah, they're small, nascent competitors, but they're going to get in the way of our brand, basically. So we're buying them. And that to me, the legislation that I put together was a reply to that email that he sent, because my legislation actually is not just about tech, but those are the only companies in the world right now that are of their size. 2 of them are over $1 trillion, and they're controlling the gateway to so many businesses, farmers who want to advertise, who want to search for things, and you like it. So there has to be change there. But then you go to things like cat food. There's only 2 companies. Online travel, you think you're getting a great deal. Well, 90% of the market is owned by 2 companies. They just have different names, but they're all owned by the same company. My favorite, if you want to sort of get a more general, in addition to ag perspective on this, John Oliver did a half an hour on this subject, and he finally ended by saying, if this is enough to make you want to die, good luck with that, because the casket market is now owned by 3 companies. Ironically, Friends at Farmers Union, one of them bought the other, so it's now 2 casket companies. So what we're seeing in ag isn't unique, but it does get us allies and friends to tackle this issue, because it's not just in one area. So what I've done here is introduce the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act. I know that's a mouthful, to update the antitrust laws. And it's gotten a pretty good reception. And I've been able to get, now it's Democrats on it only right now, but there has been Republicans interested. And I've got people from, Cory Booker and Dick Blumenthal to Mark Warner on this bill. And also I'm working with the House. They may introduce it in segments, which I've also done in the past. So there's growing interest. And as you know, there's some growing interest on the Republican side. What I keep telling them is, when you look at the history of antitrust, it started with the founding fathers who didn't want to have to buy all their tea from one monopoly tea company, the East India Tea Company. So that was a British monopoly. The throwing the tea into the harbor, the Boston Tea Party. That wasn't just about taxation without representation. It was also about having to buy from a monopoly. You go through time, Senator Sherman was a Republican from Ohio. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. There was always bipartisan support for taking on antitrust. Farmers' role, critical. That's the Granger movement. At the same time, the unions were coming up in Chicago and the like and starting to have major protests, Haymarket, all those things that were going on. The Grangers were the farmers with pitchforks taking on monopoly trains and rail, taking on monopoly control over their production. And if anyone's from Minnesota, as I know a few people are, Oliver Hudson, Kelly, who the farm that we have, it's a historic farm in Minnesota. He was one of the leaders in that. So there was a huge amount of the antitrust laws for the nation that came out of the Midwest and came out of farming. And so that's why when we look at this, we have to look at it as, I think you always do better when you get allies on things. And you're able to do things beyond just one single small thing. So the first thing I start with is funding for this, and the agencies need more funding to do monopoly investigations and the like. They are a shadow of their former selves from where they were at the AT&T breakup, and that's during the Reagan administration. There's so many less employees at the FTC, so many less people at DOJ, antitrust. And so the first part of this is actually bipartisan. It's something I've done with Senator Grassley, which you know he's been good on these issues. And that adds about $135 million to the budgets of those two antitrust divisions. The other thing is looking at mergers going forward and changing the standard, because the courts have gotten so conservative that they're just okaying everything. And people at one point for 15 years, the plaintiffs in antitrust cases, ready for this, had won 0 cases in front of the US Supreme Court. And that's before we added Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. So the best way to do this more quickly is to actually change the standards in the law, especially when there's growing Republican interest in this as well. And that would be to say that you have to show a lesser burden. And I change the burden for big mergers and say, you know what, the companies actually have to prove that this doesn't lessen competition. And it changes the thresholds from mergers that may substantially lessen competition to those that would materially lessen it. And it makes it clear that monopsonies are illegal. And monopsony is when a powerful buyer that can suppress the prices it pays for products because sellers have no viable alternatives, that is illegal. It looks at exclusionary conduct, where you have an existing company. You know, I go back to AT&T because that was such a successful breakup, and it brought down long distance fees, and it allowed for the whole cell phone industry to develop because there was actual competition. And so you look at a certain industry that way. You don't just look at mergers going forward, you look at an industry going backwards. And one of the more crazy things is at some point, they were collecting in the FTC data on industry consolidation. And we know it's incredibly high from some data we've gotten, but they stopped collecting it. And that alone would give us some really helpful information to use in antitrust cases. Other issues, and maybe we can talk more about the antitrust in the Q&A because, I just can't get enough of it. But other issues that I really appreciate the Farmers Union support on racial equity. I just co-sponsored Raphael Warnock's bill, the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act, that provides direct relief payments to farmers of color to help them get through the pandemic and pay off their farm loan debts and related taxes. The work that we have specifically done on the small and medium meat packer front, and I joined forces with Senator Jerry Moran, the Republican from Kansas, in introducing the Requiring Assistance to Meat Processors for Upgrading Plants Act. You guys just love all these names. It's actually called the Ramp Up Act, which is a lot cleaner. And we actually got that included with your support in the December COVID-19 relief bill. And I think we all know what's happening. I don't need to tell you about what's been happening with meat packing. And what this legislation did was provided $60 million in funding to help small and medium-sized meat packers make improvements to their facilities so they can meet the standards necessary for federal inspections. And it will allow them to make sales across state lines. I mean, the issue here is if it's easier for big companies to make some of these standards and harder for small, which is why our focus overall beyond ag has been on small businesses, and that PPP program is about small businesses. And then I heard you talking about how this afternoon you'll be focused on biofuels. I think you know I've long been leading on this issue. Talked about it a lot on my presidential campaign. Okay, we're not going to go there. But to me, this is just, in a way, it's another monopoly issue because you've had oil so much trying to drive out biofuels with how they control the pumps and other things. And so we have just kept pushing, and I've done a lot of that work with Senator Grassley as well. Earlier this month, we introduced, Joni Ernst and I introduced the Renewable Fuel Infrastructure Investment Act, which will provide funding for installing and converting fuel pump infrastructure to deliver higher blends of ethanol and biodiesel. It's $500 million over 5 years. I think we all remember when that went away, some of that funding. I also recently joined with Senator Grassley to continue to push on restoring integrity to the renewable fuel standards. You know, I was complaining for a year about those 85 small refinery waivers, not really small when they were giving them to major oil companies like Exxon and Chevron, but they even did it at the very end, as you all know, President Trump's term, what we call midnight waivers. And I don't think you're going to be seeing that from Secretary Vilsack. I know you're not, from his EPA administrator, who actually granted the waivers under Trump from Biden's EPA administration. And Joe Biden understands how important this is. So those are some of the things I've been working on. Of course, one of the key things is with the pandemic to keep our rural communities strong, understanding one size doesn't fit all, rural hospitals getting the vaccine out. It's not going to just parachute in the middle of Laverne, Minnesota. So getting that distribution stronger is going to help everyone. And I'm just really excited to work with you guys in the Farmers Union going forward. So thank you.
Wow. You covered a lot there, and I think it's no surprise. I think as we let folks know that you have been such a strong and important ally and important partner in much of the Farmers Union mission and what we are seeking to do and the challenges that we've been facing. And kind of tying this back just a little bit to, I mean, you make reference obviously to a lot of the challenges that the pandemic has laid on all of society, but in the agricultural world, we had a lot of the supply chain disruptions. We had the challenges at the meat processing plants, and there's that immediate need, right, to get those cogs in that machine working again, so that farmers are not left hanging, consumers have the product and access to food that they need. But it also was that kind of wake-up call, I think, for a lot of folks who didn't understand just how concentrated the ag industry and in particular the meat sector had become. And so first of all, huge thanks for your leadership in helping to advance things like the Ramp Up Act and so forth. But if you could speak or expand a little bit on that, about other ways that we can build in more local and regional processing to build that resiliency back into the system. We'll touch base a little bit on antitrust too, because that's like at the heart of our issue. But this resiliency right now for a lot of farmers and ranchers is very much front and center.
Sure. So I think part of this is, and I really appreciate you brought up the way this relates to the pandemic. And I did a little, but one of the things that everyone noticed across the country, even if you're not an expert on antitrust or on meatpacking, was the disruption by just having a few of these companies close down. And it created ripple effects throughout the entire supply chain, which of course led to unprecedented market challenges. Okay, let's just take it out of ag for a minute. How does that happen? Well, it happens if you have too much power concentration. And in example, Australia, totally different market, just a big fight going on there because Google and Facebook didn't want to have to pay for content for news. So they don't want to pay. Then they say, okay, we're going to shut down your access to Google. We're going to shut down your access to Facebook. And Facebook actually started to do it. And in the end, there was so much international pressure on them that they started to negotiate. All right, kind of a unique situation, but it just shows you what monopolies can do. In this case, they weren't deliberately closing down. They were shut down because of an unprecedented issue with the pandemic. But it means you want diversification. So that's one of the reasons, not to mention the employees close to home and the entrepreneurship and things that small businesses can bring in. So that is kind of the underlying pin to why you want to have this. You want to have resiliency. You don't want to have just power in a few hands. And of course, it hurts the small businesses, but it's also not good for our economy as a whole. It was Adam Smith, right, the godfather of capitalism, who the founding fathers listened to way back then. And while he talked about the invisible hand and all this, it was literally nearly everything he did when he talked about capitalism was he talked about the fear of the overgrown army of monopolies, and that how he literally went to the point where legislators can be afraid of them because of their political clout. So, I think that kind of idea and why we got the Ramp Up Act and we're able to get broad support is all due to the actual workings of our economy. And I would just close with this when you ask what we can do going forward on it. And maybe we can do antitrust laws next. But the first thing is to make sure we implement that program. I have talked to Secretary Vilsack about it at the hearing and elsewhere. And so we need to make sure that's implemented so we can restore competition and make sure that we get that money out. And then we just keep going with other protections that we can put in place to make sure that we don't lose our competition in meatpacking, or really for that matter, in other ag areas as well. And I know there'll be hearings on these issues going forward now that Debbie Stabenow has the gavel in the Senate Agriculture Committee. And one other thing I'd add is the Biden plan has $4 billion for food supply chain infrastructure improvements, which would also be helpful. And that's the bill that we're going to be considering in the Senate next week. And I think there's every reason to believe it's going to pass.
Appreciate that. And now turning back to the bill that you recently introduced here, the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act. I think it would be useful to kind of come back to that a little bit because, beyond the fact that I'm no expert in antitrust, it sometimes can seem like such an overwhelming topic and issue, and how do we ever get our hands on this? You initially kind of laid out that part of it, right, is providing resources to the enforcement agencies and so forth. But there obviously also has to be the compelling desire to enforce. And so could you kind of walk out, a little bit of the strategy behind the specific provisions in your bill?
Of course. So when you ask people, when they ask themselves maybe, well, why are my flights so expensive just to go a short distance from a more mid-sized market airport to a smaller one? Or why does my cable cost so much? And people are noticing that a lot during the pandemic, and we've seen these record increases. Or why did the seeds cost so much? Or why haven't we, and this is one of my favorite examples, developed privacy or misinformation bells and whistles on tech? Well, if you have so much consolidation, you stop having any incentive to, one, bring down prices, and two, innovate. Why would you want to create some new product that would work really well when you've got a monopoly? And that was, of course, the base problem with AT&T. They weren't doing much to develop the cell phone market. They had both a vertical and a horizontal monopoly. And what that means, it's simple to understand. You think about like Coke and Pepsi, if they combined, right? That would be a horizontal monopoly. AT&T owned all of the phone service across the country. Vertical monopolies, like a building up and down. They also owned all of the actual technology. Remember the old phones and things like that. And so that was both a horizontal and a vertical monopoly. And you see some of that as well, as you know, in agriculture. So the whole idea here is to try to get at this, to me, economy-wide, and not to get rid of capitalism. We're proud of the success. I've represented private companies before I became a senator. I get all this, but it's actually to rejuvenate capitalism. And we've certainly seen the need for that in the agriculture area. So you start with, yeah, make sure there's good enforcement going on. That was what I brought up with adding, bringing those agencies back to life with resources. And we definitely have Republican support on that. We actually had Trump administration support on that, but I wasn't able to get it at the end of last year through the House Republicans. But since we dominate the House, barely, but we do, we should be able to pass something on that very soon with Senator Grassley's support. Secondly, you look at the mergers and what I brought up about how you got to make it easier to question those mergers. It doesn't mean you turn them all down. It just means that you're able to, when a merger comes before you, like Monsanto did, when those things come, and if they're big mega mergers, which we define as more than $5 billion, then you've got to have a different burden of proof. And they have to really show their stuff. The government doesn't just have to show that something's wrong. The companies have to show that they do not materially lessen of competition, or as I call it, an appreciable risk of materially lessening competition. The other thing is just looking at the markets the way they are down now, and looking at, like, one example. I keep using some tech examples because I think it's really important to put this in the larger context. When Facebook looks at buying Instagram, at the time the antitrust people or WhatsApp, they're like, oh, well, those are pretty small companies, it's okay. Well, it's not okay if they have a over 50% market share. And that's one of the points that we make for mergers going forward. And then looking back, you look at the whole market as a whole, just like you might with livestock or seeds or the like, and you say, okay, is there too much concentration? Then you can go in and do something about it. So that's kind of the basic approach. And there's other things I'm not going to go into, like prejudgment interest, that you could get that, some bigger fines. All of that will matter because it will be disincentives for people consolidating even more. Look at freight railway. Right now we have over 90% of freight railway is by, if you look at the class 1 carriers, the big ones, it's down to 4. There used to be dozens of them. And as I noted at one hearing, that's the exact same number of railroads on the monopoly board. And all of that affects your prices and how you can sell your goods. If in fact, whether it is livestock or poultry or commodities, if in fact your input costs go up because of monopolies.
Well, I tell you, we're just about it. There's questions coming in, and there's a lot of excitement around this topic, obviously, because this is really gets to the heart of what a lot of the kind of fundamental challenges are with the food system, and from our perspective at the farm level. You know, I would also just highlight very quickly that, you know, the tech sector, as you keep kind of referencing back, right, does get a lot of attention in the press and so forth, but it is so thankful that we have somebody there in a position of leadership leading this effort, who, while we talk about the kind of more society at large, you know, the biggest firms out there, understands very well that in the ag sector there continues to be a big problem.
Right. And we will have a hearing in the antitrust in the antitrust subcommittee on ag. We're going to do a general one first, and one other one, and then we're going to have a series of hearings. I didn't have the gavel till now, so
Exactly.
me a lot of ability to have these hearings, get information out, and then build political support for our bill. And you know, we can also, we'll continue to break the bill down into different parts and work on it that way. But I just don't think we can keep pretending nothing's happening here. Just ask, when we look at the numbers of everything from dairy to commodity farmers, and look at how we've lost so many small farms. This has got to be part of the answer. It's not the only answer, but it's a big part of the answer. And that's part of why it's been hard for people to exist as small farmers. And that's the backbone of agriculture and pretty much the backbone of our country. And we don't want supply chain disruptions all over the place because we only have a few monopolies. It also affects, of course, wages and the like when you have less companies that people can go work for. Can think of it that way.
Well, thank you so much. And I would just share, I think folks are probably getting a flavor for the homework that you do on a lot of issues and so forth. But I always like to think back to a story years ago during a much previous campaign where you were sidelined with some knee trouble, and where a reasonable person might be expected to make sure that they are icing, have it up, and they are doing the full recovery. You were on the phone constantly wanting to know the very intricate details of farm and ag policy. And that was my first indication that you do your homework.
Rob, it's a little worse than that. So I had hip surgery that didn't go well 6 months before. They had to remove my entire hip, do it again. I was at Mayo Clinic. I had to have 2 blood transfusions, and I did the farm debate, which Gary knows. I think he was there and helped me prepare for this 6 days after hip surgery. And I came in on crutches. And I remember a candidate on our side that wasn't running against me looked at me. I looked pretty pale, and he goes, "Are you on a bunch of painkillers? Can you do this debate?" I go, "No, I'm on no painkillers, just doing the debate." So anyway, yes, it was kind of dramatic, but from the hospital bed, I spoke with Gary. I spoke with everyone to get the facts, and including a number of people nationally. And I won that debate. And then we opened a lead that we couldn't against a congressman that led me to victory. That's a true story. So.
Well, we need leaders who are willing to do the homework and stand up for what's right. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Gary. Thanks, everyone. Keep up the good work.
Alrighty, at this point, we are ready to switch and speak to another native Minnesotan, I might say, but moved to Maine when she was a teenager. Representative Chellie Pingree represents the 1st Congressional District of Maine, where she's served since 2009. She's a member of the House Agriculture Committee, as well as the House Appropriations Committee. And she has been a leader not only in the state during her time there at the state Senate. She's also been a farmer and a small business owner. She served on the local school board and as a tax assessor. Leader on so many issues, really that's very close and dear to our Farmers Union members, including strengthening the local and regional food systems. We've worked very closely with Representative Pingree, and we've counted on her as not only a champion of our issues, but also a friend of the organization. Congresswoman Pingree, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I might ask you to start with just kind of an overview in this issue of livestock, in particular, but the broader question of concentration and consolidation and the impacts that it has on our food system. As we referenced earlier, this has a very direct impact on not only farmers and those who are growing and producing the food, but consumers on the other end. And much of that is tied to this consolidation in the middle and some of the work that you do. If you could share.
Sure. First, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to share the stage with Amy. And yes, you're right. I'm originally from Minnesota, came to Maine as a teenager, but my grandfather, like so many Minnesotans, was a Norwegian immigrant and had a farm in Kenyon, Minnesota, and I grew up in Minneapolis. So yeah, sure, you betcha. And I agree with her, the Minnesota State Fair, still the best. So don't let anyone in Maine hear that, but it's true. Yeah, so I have given a lot of focus to this issue of, particularly the unavailability of small slaughterhouses. And I think this is a topic that's really moved to the forefront, particularly during the pandemic, as we've seen the breakdown of the supply chain. But just to give you a little background and context, as you said, I'm a small farmer myself. I've had small farms on and off since the 1970s, starting by, slaughtering our own animals and then constantly searching for a slaughterhouse that was available. I continue to have a small farm today. We just raise a few pigs and chickens and beef animals. And like a lot of people who are trying to be in this business, you make a date with a slaughterhouse the day your animal is born. And you just hope that nothing happens to get in the way. And it's often requires a lot of transportation. I just happen to farm on a small island. So our animals, as they travel to freezer camp, as we call it, spend an hour on a ferry, and then we drive for another 2 hours, and you get a flat tire on the way, and you got a problem. But I don't think I have to tell too many people, who are here with us today, that is a huge challenge. But the good news, as I said, is that there's been a lot of increased focus on this, and some of it goes beyond just, those people who are practicing. As Amy rightfully said, so much of this has to do with consolidation in the industry, and we really, have had our eyes open during the pandemic about the consolidation in the slaughter industry, and also, just the extreme danger to the workers who are often in these huge facilities. It's astonishing the number of people who contracted the disease, who unfortunately died from the disease, and then the huge challenges that farmers had to dealing with the big slaughterhouses when they couldn't take the capacity. And, to say that was a catastrophic nightmare for farmers, whether it was having to euthanize their animals or, find a way to dispose of them. It's just unthinkable during a time in the pandemic when people were also really struggling to put food on the table. So I think that in many ways helped people to focus on what an issue this was. See it on the supermarket shelves that they're empty and want to know, what to do about it. So, frankly, in many ways, I hate to say it, but it's been helpful to me and my colleagues because it's been evident to the broader public. Then that sometimes means that some of my other colleagues in Congress have gotten a focus on this. One other opportunity here that I think has even grown during the pandemic is the interest of people buying food locally. We're always anxious to promote, and I've worked on so much legislation around promoting small to medium-sized farmers and selling direct to consumers. But when people walked into an empty grocery store, they suddenly started to say, is there someone in my area that sells these products? And I know in Maine, we've had a 2- or 3-fold increase in the amount of sales that have gone to people who are buying locally. But that's just exacerbated this problem of a lack of infrastructure. So a lot of the legislation that I've been focusing on has really been about how do we get that infrastructure available, and how do we support farmers in this moment where, once again, there's huge market opportunities out there, but we haven't always had an ear at the USDA, or there's been opposition, from all kinds of sources who don't really understand the value of having much more local infrastructure available. And I'm happy to talk more about the legislation that we've been working on.
Yeah, if you could, actually. I mean, certainly you are somebody, as you just pointed out, that has been working and has drafted a lot of legislation kind of related pretty directly here, and certainly around the edges as well. And we might start though with this strengthening the Local Processing Act, the work that you've done with Fortenberry, Congressman Fortenberry of Nebraska. First of all, it's always refreshing to our members, as you might not be surprised, bipartisan efforts, right? And not only that, but sometimes in ag, some of these issues seem on the surface, like they might be regional based, but we know that this issue is one that is, all across the country. And so could you talk a little bit about the effort there and then where you hope that might lead?
Sure, and I just want to emphasize the point you made. It's really wonderful to work on agricultural issues. We don't always agree, but they are generally bipartisan in many ways, and they're often regional. Sometimes it's fighting over, what New England farmers want and what Midwestern or California farmers want. But I've been intrigued to find out that people like Representative Fortenberry, who's from Nebraska, and as he said, there's as much big beef going on in his district as anywhere else, but he still sees this need. He's concerned about the consolidation, but also knows that there's real opportunities in selling more locally. But if you have to deal with huge slaughterhouses, that's not an opportunity. So he and I just introduced this, and it's got already a good range of co-sponsors, and we're working on it in the Senate as well. So it does a variety of things. It helps small facilities with their HACCP plans, the food safety side of it, which can be burdensome. It expands federal support for state inspection and programs in the cooperative interstate shipment, which opens up some new markets for livestock and poultry people. 27 states currently have a state inspection program, and 8 of them participate in that cross-border CIS that I mentioned. And so expanding that to other states will be very helpful to allow for sales outside of the state that you're working in. It also has competitive grants of up to $500,000 to help small facilities with some of the costs that are associated with growing. Most small facilities today are busting out at the seams, and expanding your facility, meeting new regulations is very expensive, and so that's a great way to have some money available. It also has some career training programs, because often access to labor or well-trained workers, can be challenging. It's not an easy industry to work in, but I think working at a small to medium-sized facility is usually preferable to some of the challenges of the really big ones. So that's a really, it's a great opportunity, and I think we're going to have some momentum behind it.
It's great. There's a lot of synergies with our members and some of the activities that they're doing in the state divisions. I know that there are a number of states that are currently working to help get the education out there for that for workers in this space, to make sure that that as we are creating opportunities, that we have the skilled staff and workers to do that. So it's really important, I think, that you're including that provision in here. And you spoke to the inspection side of this, and obviously I think of everybody's utmost concern is food safety, right? But can you reflect a little bit on the challenge of trying to make sure that we have resources available for federal inspection, and often that goes right to the absolute largest plants, where there sometimes can be this pull between wanting to go as fast as possible and get as much meat processed out as possible, with making sure that we have the resources to have inspectors at small, medium-sized plants as well, and what that challenge might be, from the federal resources.
Sure. Well, there's kind of a couple different topics here. When it comes to the big facilities, issues around line speed have been a subject of much debate, and because I sit on both AgriProx and the Agriculture Committee, it comes up a lot. And I think there are a lot of concerns about the inspection system and the line speeds, because that is usually what makes it the most dangerous for workers, if animals are moving by too quickly, or if there isn't sufficient time to make sure the inspection happens properly. So I think that will continue to be an argument that happens, and there was some relaxation of the standards over the last 4 years, and I have a feeling we'll discuss that again this year. Also, capacity of inspectors. We've had a lot of people who work in the inspection system who have also had to struggle with the COVID this year, and we've lost some as well. And so the importance of making sure that both they're safe and are well protected, but that we also are attracting people into that system is important. The current rescue plan that we're working on right now, that Senator Klobuchar mentioned, that's just about to go, well, we'll vote on it today and then it'll go to the Senate, has some money in there for overtime of inspectors, because that was yet another challenge, is that for a lot of facilities, they're reluctant to go into overtime, even if they have the capable inspectors, because it's just a huge financial burden on an already, probably tight margin. So I think that help will be important. I've just forgotten what the second half of your question was. Oh, safety. Yeah. Boy, I've been working on, I started with the Prime Act, which the language for that, I think I tried to put in the first farm bill 2 farm bills ago. And that always gets brought up as a safety issue. And that bill, Prime Act, was just really to expand to 2 states that have state inspection systems, that you could move the meat product from one state to another. And the fact is, if you have state inspected facilities, they may not have a USDA inspector in there all the time, but they're subject to a very large amount of inspection. And so to say that somehow these aren't as safe, I think is sort of questioning the whole process of how we inspect meat in states. I feel very confident about our state facilities, about the, people who work within our state Department of Agriculture to make sure they maintain those facilities. So we're not talking about, expanding to backyard slaughter, or, something that, you might do on your own just for yourself or your family. These are still inspected facilities. And I think that the constant pressure that's opposed allowing us to, expand or support those facilities has been part of what's fed the consolidation in the industry, because that's kind of the only place to go. But it's also kept a lot of farmers from, again, capturing this market, which can be, very lucrative if you're allowed to sell, a certain amount retail directly to your customers. And I think the interest is only increasing. And I think with the focus on climate change, we're going to see more support for that with the Biden administration and our new USDA with our seasoned USDA secretary. But I also think that customers are going to, start to expand their interest in, buying more locally, because it's not something that's been shipped around the country or halfway around the world.
Well, certainly the demand is there. We all, a lot of us live it, and you certainly have direct experience with it. And as you talked about, many of these, whether they're custom exempt plants or state inspected plants, so many of these places are really at capacity. And so it's, about being able to have the resources and the, to kind of ramp that, well, not to play upon the ramp up, but to build that out a little bit more. What do you see as we look at trying to build in more resources, whether it's for inspection on small, medium-sized plant, whether it's trying to allow greater flexibility for these state inspected plants? What are the potential impediments that we need to be mindful of as we build this out into a more local and resilient system?
Well, I mean, there has always been a certain amount of opposition from the bigger meat producers. But I think that, like I said, I think that we have to balance their strength a little bit. And I think there's a lot of concerns, both with the consolidation in the industry, the foreign ownership of most meat processors today. And so, I think it's easier to sort of argue against that that's important. But more importantly, I would say, number one, we have to have a USDA that really understands the value of this market, the growth in the market, and the opportunities for farmers. Just to step back for a minute, the USDA is there to serve American farmers, to make sure that they can make a good living, that there aren't impediments to them doing business, to support the future of farming in this country. And missing these opportunities for infrastructure, I think, is just a dereliction of duty. That's what the USDA is for. I'm heartened that I know Secretary Vilsack, and I've had a chance to talk to him about it, but I know, he's got a lot of understanding of the importance of this, and I think he will make it a priority and will support it. That said, there needs to be financial support for the very things that we were talking about, whether it's support to small processors, dealing with overtime issues, writing safety plans, for those who want to expand, having some financial support out there, or also other creative ideas that farmers have been working on, putting together a co-op that does the meat processing in an area where there's just no availability, but no one person that wants to start the business. There's been certain amount of success with mobile processing. It's got its own challenges, but there are some opportunities there. I think, some of the legislation that we're working on will be helpful. But one thing I'm also looking towards is the potential future in an infrastructure bill. There's a lot of talk about an infrastructure bill. Certainly, President Biden has said this is a high priority for him. And I think there will be a lot of promotion of having infrastructure that's related to positive job creation around climate change. And you can certainly make an argument, like I said, that processing more locally, selling more locally is a great way to reduce the amount of transportation that's involved in meat slaughter. I think that there's, or in meat, in sales of meat from one place to the other. There's a growing interest in pasture-raised beef, and I think there will be a lot of support at the USDA for programs that help farmers to sequester more carbon, and certainly permanent pasture does that. Plus, a lot of consumers see it as a healthy product, so the demand is way up. In fact, you can't meet the demand in America today with the amount that's being raised. But again, a lot of that happens on a more local scale, a smaller scale. It allows us to use much more sort of marginal land that isn't particularly good for crops, but it's good for permanent pasture. But that just means more availability of slaughterhouses to process that meat, whether it's, sheep, goats, beef, pasture-raised chickens, hogs, it's all out there. So I think there are lots of good opportunities, and I think it's just a very good moment in time with bipartisan support, a real understanding of the importance of rethinking our supply chain. And there's money in this current package that we're voting on for addressing some of the issues around the supply chain, but then looking into the future and understanding that we just lost a lot of our agricultural infrastructure that was helpful to small to medium-sized farmers. And a lot of that had to do with the consolidation in the industry. But I know, in places like New England, and, you don't always think about the importance of New England when you live in the Midwest, but, Maine was a real agricultural powerhouse in the 1800s, and there was a canning factory in every town, and there were, facilities for processing. We don't have that anymore, but there's a real interest in doing more of that again, but we need some support to do it.
Sure. I really appreciate the emphasis on infrastructure, right? And this kind of tie back to the fact that, in a lot of areas, it wasn't that long ago at all that there was, more local processing, that there was, the local meat locker or custom exempt plant that was closed, and now those are getting further behind. But we also know that, there may not be, an immediate local market for all of this product, and that, other challenges beyond, making sure that we rebuild, if you will, this infrastructure for local processing, that there is also tackling the other side of this issue, which is the antitrust and the competition issues themselves, right? And obviously, Senator Klobuchar focused a lot on that. But I might ask for reflection on conversations that are taking place in the House, efforts to look at the issue more closely, whether it's at the big tech kind of firms, and what that might do for the ag space here on competition at large.
Sure. I'm not as, I haven't worked on the issues of antitrust as much, certainly not as much as Senator Klobuchar, but I'm always supportive and co-sponsor those pieces of legislation. As you said, and as she said, it's really throughout our lives today, from high tech to coffins, as John Oliver talked about and she talked about. But I think there's almost no part of the economy that's been as impacted as agriculture, and it's not just because of the financial impact of it, but it's because small farms and medium-sized farms have been such an important way of life for people. The idea of raising your family on a farm or being in a rural area has just been so critically important to people. And as we've lost farms in rural areas, it doesn't just mean, the farms are gone, but it also means, the tractor dealer, and then it's the grocery store, and then it's the local cafe. It's all, so tied together. And I think the downfall and economic challenges of our rural economy have to be more in the forefront of this administration. And I think they are, and I think they will be with this USDA. But again, I come from Maine, and we're the most rural state in the nation, and people don't always think about that because they think of the East Coast as being very populated, but we're a big state with a lot of small towns, and each one of those has to have a certain amount of kind of infrastructure to maintain it. But a lot of the loss of agriculture here has really been from consolidation into other parts of the country. We actually had a fairly significant poultry industry, but throughout the last century, it just started to disappear as we had less availability of land to grow corn on, or it was easy to grow and ship chickens from other parts of the country as opposed to growing things more locally. So it's a big conversion to go back in the other direction. And I think that deconsolidation is one of the biggest issues to tackle, because you're talking about, a different kind of regulatory climate, but also the breakup of a lot of consolidations that's already existing and already has happened. But that said, it doesn't make it any less important to deal with. And it's not just about the processing side of the industry, it's about agriculture itself. And one of the reasons not being an expert on the ag economy, but that there's been a lot of consolidation is just because of the small margins and the difficulty of farmers to make a living. We've seen a lot of growth and expansion in agriculture in the state of Maine, and most of it, I guess I'd have to call it a resurgence in the last 1 to 2 decades. But a lot of it has been because we had available farmland that was abandoned, 50 years earlier, because it wasn't economically viable. And so we've had a much younger population move in to work on a lot of these farms. And the way they've made them successful is by capturing either a value-added market or selling directly to consumers. And the younger the farmer is, I think the more unique of a marketing plan they've been able to put together, using the technology, using phone apps to do ordering. I mean, CSAs are very prevalent in our state, and farmers markets have grown. All those are economic opportunities that go against consolidation. But part of it is on the regulatory side, the breakup. But I think another huge part of it, and something really I've focused a lot of attention on, is supporting local farming, supporting farmers markets, supporting grants to small farmers to do more value-added things. A lot of programs that are at the USDA but have been underutilized, but having them available creates the viability and opportunity for small to medium-sized farms to thrive. And we have to put an emphasis on that, because it won't do us any good to just say, we're going to try to figure out how to break all this up if we haven't created the opportunities for people to do it on a different scale.
Very true. And I think you got to the heart of the issue here, right? Is that for too many farmers, this lack of competition in the space has driven these margins so razor thin that being able to stay in business and continue to grow and keep those family farms in those rural communities becomes all of the bigger challenge. So appreciate kind of reflection on all of these issues. Here in closing, I might just ask you to kind of go back to that theme of bipartisanship in agriculture. Certainly, we saw the markup of the provisions to go into the relief package, and we, as you look, I've been part of those kind of budget reconciliation efforts in the past. They're not always fun, but as you look beyond that and going forward, kind of the agenda of the chairman of the Democrats, but equally important, making sure that we are looking for building those allies and that partnership in a bipartisan way.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a really important topic, and I think it's a big theme, and I think the Agriculture Committee has always prided itself on its bipartisanship. That said, if you watch the markup of the reconciliation, there was a lot of contention in that, and I think reconciliation as a process is almost impossible to do without a certain amount of disagreement, because one party is using its advantage over the other one. We felt the same way when the Republican package on tax cuts went through, because they used reconciliation and we weren't able to do it. But we've put that to bed. And as you've said, there's a new chair of the Agriculture Committee in the House, David Scott from Georgia, and he's got a long history on the committee and a lot of bipartisan relationships himself, but he hasn't been afraid to just start out by saying, number one, we're going to tackle climate change. And then we're going to have a hearing on Black farmers and go to a lot of issues that haven't always been tackled in a bipartisan way. And we had a very long hearing yesterday on climate change. And while there were, some arguments that went on, and is it appropriate for Secretary Vilsack to use the CCC to create a carbon bank, and all these big questions we're going to have to go sort through in the future. It was a 6 or 7 hour dialogue of both sides of the aisle, sort of talking about a variety of issues, whether it's carbon sequestration and carbon markets for farmers, or, weather changes. And I can say to you, as someone who's worked, I've been in Congress for 12 years and served on both these committees, and I'm a farmer, but also an environmentalist. It was one of the more engaged and productive conversations that I've ever heard in Congress about climate change. There was very little debate about, is it real or not? It was about, how are we going to help our farmers get through this? How do they deal with adverse weathers? If there are carbon markets, how do we make sure the small to medium sized farmers benefit from this and it doesn't all go to the big guys, but you know, the key questions that we have to talk about. So I guess I would say I'm hopeful. I think, you know, President Biden is putting together an administration of experienced people who've dealt with a lot of these issues over time. And, you know, you can sort of talk about like, let's all be friends and be bipartisan. But the truth is you got to dig into the issues, work through your differences and have some success. And that will make for, you know, better working relationships going into the future than anything else. And honestly, I think we're poised to do some of that, and I'm excited about it.
Thank you for that. And obviously, thank you so much for sharing not only the work that you're doing, but your reflections and perspective on a lot of the issues that are so critically important to the future of family farmers and ranchers. Really do value your time, and thank you for joining us and for being a friend.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I appreciate the work of the National Farmers Union. You guys are just such an important voice. And I couldn't do the work that I try to do in Congress without you guys, you know, being an important voice for farmers and really representing some very thoughtful and important ideas. So good to be with you. Take care.
Alrighty, thank you. Well, this brings us to the end of the program for this webinar. This session will be available once again on our convention website, www.nfu.org/convention. Don't forget, we have another panel that starts at 3:30 p.m. Eastern on how biofuels will factor into policies from the new Congress and administration. It will be very insightful conversation, and I hope you can join in. And lastly, if you're not a delegate to our convention on Monday and Tuesday, you can still watch the proceedings. Just go to the National Farmers Union website and follow our live video stream. The event starts at 10 a.m. Eastern on both Monday and Tuesday, March 1st and 2nd. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.